Stephen Pressfield was right. There is a war on art, but it's not fought in the way that we think it is. Welcome to the show. This is episode 7 of Earbud U. London Ladd is a talented and successful children's book illustrator, speaker, presenter, and a man of deep faith. I'm always fascinated by people who can incorporate the deepest aspects of their beliefs into the work that they do on a daily basis. I think that London is trying to mount a forward action in the war on art. But let's be clear. The war on art begins with the distractions and interruptions of everyday life that cause people to avoid doing their best work and serve as excuses for not getting ahead. The war on art begins when artists, creatives, engineers, supervisors, and others begin to believe that inspiration comes only at special times rather than when your ass hits the chair. The war on art begins when anybody stops following their long-term guiding principles in favor of a short-term payday. Look, reacting when you were wrong feels good. Revenge feels good. The idea that revenge is a dish best served cold appeals to this sense. The idea that the best revenge is a life well lived is not quite as satisfying. Some of us become addicted to getting even. We become rageaholics who need anger management classes and go all Medea when they are cut off in traffic, denied appropriate levels of attention, or when their feelings are not properly acknowledged. Two places where this is seen the most in mainstream areas are traffic, like when you're in your car, and through social media. Twitter, Facebook, Google+, and others allow people to sound off and react immediately the second that they are triggered. Most notably, through flame wars and other reprehensible behavior in online article commentary sections, this shows up as well. Reacting, we can all agree, solves problems, creates panaceas of peace, and helps people develop their higher selves. Right? Yeah, right. Responding, on the other hand, responding is hard. Responding requires us to quiet the raging volcano of emotional responses inside of us. It requires us to develop a level of maturity that will win the ultimate war on the ultimate art that is us. And now a bit of the usual stuff. You can connect with Earbud U on Twitter at EarbudU. You can also check us out on Instagram. We tweet and post images on both of those social platforms with the hashtag Be Part of the Show. We are part of our parent company, Human Services Consulting and Training, out of Endicott, New York. So check out the HSCT website at www.hsconsultingandtraining.com. As for London Ladd, he's on Facebook and online at www.londonladd.com. Connect with him for all of your illustration needs or to book him to speak at your local school. And now, let's get into it.
Welcome to Earbud U, Episode 7. Get your knowledge on through your earbuds. My name is Jesan Sorrells. Our special guest for our show today is London Ladd, noted children's book illustrator, artist, and social activist. London has used his talents in the areas of drawing, painting, and illustrating to create books, children's books specifically, that focus on Oprah, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and many, many other famous individuals. London has a great working process for connecting his art to children and a compelling personal story. Welcome to Earbud U, London. How are you doing this morning?
Great. How are you today?
Great. So let's get started. Let's get into our questions. All right. Okay. So I gave an awesomely long opening there, but I ask all my guests, what is it that you do exactly?
I am a children's book illustrator. And as a children's book illustrator, you're responsible to take a story from a publisher that an author has presented. And with that story, you're in charge of basically creating images, bringing it to life on paper. So when I get a story, let's say of something like Oprah, Martin Luther King, Frederick Douglass, I'm in charge of just kind of bringing to life on paper that story, and it's great. It's amazing. I love doing it because what it does is it gives me a chance to kind of be a director in a two-dimensional form. Whereas you have film, it's like obviously motion picture. It's like one of the oldest professions is to take something and bring life in a picture form with colors and drawings and stuff. So I enjoy it. I love it. probably the main thing that I do love is to kind of solve a problem. That's what I think. I had a peer of mine tell me that we as illustrators, we're more problem solvers because we're in charge of taking, words, like I told you before, and figuring out the best way to show those words in one picture sometimes. It's not like graphic novels where you have multiple panels. In the children's book, most likely you have one page and you usually will have a bunch of words. Sometimes they're poems, 2 or 3 lines. Sometimes they're 3 or 4 paragraphs, like the Martin Luther King book, which is very wordy. And you just have to find a moment and figure out what best exemplifies those words in one shot.
Now, as a person who has a background in the arts, and I've talked about this with several other guests who also have backgrounds in the arts, film, literature, that kind of stuff, those kinds of areas. I'm fascinated by children's book illustrators because, as you said, you try to find that core moment that really sort of is going to capture a child's attention, and you're really targeting. I don't know what the demographic is that you're targeting with your stories primarily, but I mean, when I think of children, that's a wide range of interests that are just sort of like a hummingbird,
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you connect with that story to find that moment? How do you do that?
I don't know. That's a good question because the most important thing, I think, when you have a children's book story, you got to find something that connects to you on a personal level. I think, just like in any other form, like whether it's music, whether it's film, whether it's anything in the arts, if you connect to it, it becomes a little bit more real, and it becomes something that can pour out of your heart. So, like with the Martin Luther King book, finding that moment in the story where you're just like, wow, and for me it was like a sense of wanting to be there, during that march, during the 24 hours that built up to his I Have a Dream speech. With the Oprah book, it was kind of like what connected with me was her childhood, just a sense of being, her parents had to leave her with her grandparents.
Mm-hmm.
So her mother left her with her parents while they worked, so
Right.
She was like, there was like a sense of almost abandonment, but yet there was love there that helped nurture her as who she is today. So there was
Mm-hmm.
a connection there. So what I try to do to solve anything with these stories is to connect to it, to really humanize it. So when I'm painting it, those memories and those feelings and emotions, they kind of spill out, whether it's in the sketchbook or from the paintbrush to the paint to the board.
Yep.
And then hopefully to the readers.
Awesome. Well, what's sort of the nitty gritty? Because I'm a process guy. I love comedians, and I love hearing stories about comedians because I think comedy is the ultimate, sort of presenting and speaking / training / performance art, where you have to get up in front of a room of people who are not necessarily maybe on your side and really get them to laugh, and you have to do it inside of 30 seconds, because if you don't, I mean, that's it. It's over. So one of the things I'm fascinated by is process. So you talked about sort of connecting with the story. What's your process? What's the sort of step-by-step breakdown for that? Like, do you get the script from the publisher? Do you get it, and I say script because of my background in comics, but do you get the story from the writer, and then you sort of have to sit with it for a while, and then you pull out the paints and you start sketching? Or how does that work? How do you work that process?
Well, the first thing I do, once I get, obviously you get the story from the publisher, who through my agent. This publisher will go through my agent, and they will give it to me, and they will ask, are you interested in this story? And you want to read it, and you kind of see. And mostly, I've never turned down a story. I think I've only turned down one story, only because it was time constraints, and I just couldn't fit it, even though it was on a historical figure that I admired. Another one. But once I get the story, once I read it, and I was like, okay, let's do this. We get the story officially after the contract is signed, and when I start reading it, I read it slow and kind of ingest it, then I'll read it again and then let some ideas kind of like pictures in my head, what those words are trying to convey. And then, I'll look through it again and I'll just kind of do little thumbnail quick sketch drawings of scenes that maybe have popped into my head. Maybe it may be one that pops out that just speaks to your heart, my heart. And sometimes it just takes longer, where you have to do multiple, and sometimes it won't even come. You move forward, and then you just kind of build around it. And then after you do some thumbnails, then you just kind of pick out ones that really are the strongest, and then you kind of just do a little bit tighter, like loose. It's a loose drawing, but it's a little bit more refined. Then you do some research. I really like, because a lot of this stuff is historical that I've done. So you research the subject. And then
that's interesting to me that you research. Not to interrupt you, but that's interesting that you hit the research after you've already sort of put some things down on paper with the drawing process there, and with that sort of hands-on creative process, and then you jump into the book and try to find the research. That's interesting to me.
Yeah, because I want to try to kind of now. It helps set up the pages where you kind of design it. So now, if like the book with Under the Freedom Tree, which is about contraband slaves in Virginia, and it's about a 400-year-old tree. So the thing is, when I got the story and I kind of did some sketches, what I did is I kind of researched what this tree, what is this tree? And it's a 400-year-old tree that's been around since the birth of America, and the historical significance of this tree that it's been around. And then you look it up and you go on the internet. But then what I like to do is go one step further and talk to people, and to be able to kind of gauge the importance. So like with Under the Freedom Tree, I called some, the Contraband Historical Society. I talked to people who have a direct correlation to this particular historical event, and then you just hear from them and you get these little nuggets. So then when I go back to sketching it, now little things that come in that I didn't even think of to add, now I add them in there, and it just helps really get it right. Like little nuggets. So if there's like something within a line or that I want to just include without making it the focal point, but just putting it in there so the viewer can see that. And what it does is it challenges the viewer, the kid, the children, the adult, but most likely the children. So then when I sketch it out, send it out to the publisher, they figure they take a few weeks, sometimes a month, to really look over it, have the author look over it, and then they have meetings, and then they bring it back to me with revisions. And then I got to fix up the sketches. I take photographs. I do a lot of photographic reference. So I use models, sometimes myself, family members, friends. And then once the revisions and everything, they're happy with all the sketches, then I start painting, that can take anywhere from 8 to 16 weeks, give or take the deadline. It's good to have more time. And then once you finish those paintings, you show them to the publisher. Then they look, and then they go through. And it's funny because the publisher will look, and then they'll have editors, art directors, designers, author, and they'll have historians look at it. So then the historians will look to make sure that everything's historically accurate. And with Under the Freedom Tree, it was fun. There was a page where it shows the Confederate camp, where the 3 escaped slaves flee from. And I put a Confederate flag in there, but I guess the historian that researched it looked and said that we can't have the Confederate flag, you've got to have the Virginia state flag, because they separated and became the Confederate state, so they had an individual state flag. So they said put that in there, because that's historically accurate. So, and then once you get that back, then you can paint, and then once you're done, you send them off, and then you just wait for the book.
Right, and even just watching you talk about it, like I sense sort of the tension around the first part of the process where you're sort of making art by committee. You send everything off, and then this committee says, Virginia, they didn't have a Confederate flag. So why don't you take that out, so that we can be historically accurate. And I imagine that probably creates a lot of stress and a lot of conflicts because, you have an artistic vision and you want to see that artistic vision realized. And I don't want to say in spite of the story, but, to sort of enhance the story. But then you have all these other people who have all these other interests who are sitting at the table as well.
Right. Yeah, and I think that we all want to create the best book possible because for me, to work by committee, because it becomes too one-sided where if I'm the artist and I say, no, because then you become a problem. I had an illustrator friend who he got a reputation as being difficult. Because he was very pushy with his vision. I mean, this guy, he's been in the business for over 20 years, so I think he deserves a certain right of, if he's won multiple awards and he's got a fan base, you tend to almost have like that diva personality. So it's like, with me being so fresh into this, I've been in this for about 6-7 years, I want to create the best book. And and these people, they want to create the best book because that's what it's about. We want to sell books and get them out to the people and just have them enjoy and maybe learn something or just have the pleasure of, because for a child to have a book, those are lasting memories. So, there's sometimes where you fight for things and there's certain things where you're just like, I want this. This is like with the Frederick Douglass book, the first page of the book, where the young Frederick is being taken away from his mother, I had this vision where I had an original vision, but they rejected it. I had him sleeping on the floor in an empty slave cabin. They didn't like that, so they said they wanted something where he was being taken from his mother. So then what I did is I thought it would be interesting to show the master walking away or an overseer walking away with the baby in the foreground, and you show the mother kind of lunging, screaming. And to me, it was powerful because it was almost like 12 years a slave. You see a lot of documentaries where they show the slaves being separated, families being broken up, and you just have that moment where the woman screams out, and that's what I wanted. But then when they saw that, they still wanted, well, maybe can we just have it where you see the man's hands and you see the mother with the baby and the emotions of the mother. And I'm like, no, I understand that idea, but this idea, I think you open the first page, you want to hit them hard because Frederick Douglass's story is powerful. It's, the era of slavery is powerful. And I don't want to, their idea was good. I didn't do the original idea with him in the slave cabin alone, which they made a great point. And I felt like the revision was better, but then they wanted something else. But I was like, and they understood, because you got to give and take. It's like anything in life. You got to negotiate. It's all about negotiate. If I'm willing to fight for this, I will concede this. And they're good people. I've never worked with a bad editor, a bad art director. Sometimes the only project I've really had, it's funny that I've had where it was just like conflict, where I was just like, boy, this is a little too much. Was when they're called educational projects, and when they're like textbooks, and these projects, they're smaller, they don't pay as much, but they seem to want more for what they pay. And it's like, wow, I get more resistance from these guys than the big publishing houses.
Right.
And but I understand, and it's like I know what their heart is in. They want it right, and they got a vision. And as long as you kind of work it out, I've never really had a bad experience. Everything has been like I listen, ingest it, take a day or two to kind of respond. Because the worst thing you'd want to do is like you get it and then you let your emotions rise up and then you just no, you got to sit back and like think and understand where they're coming from, and then you kind of talk about where you're coming from. So there's always conflict in art.
Right, yeah. Well, and yeah, I mean it is. I mean, one of the areas that I do some work in is in, conflict in the arts and managing that. And so, artists are people, editors are people, historians are people, educators are people, and anytime you have a group of people getting together working on a project, there's going to be disagreements. And, conflict in and of itself is not inherently negative. It's typically how we handle conflict.
Exactly.
Negative and or positive. So, all right. Well, I mean, it sounds as though, like you said, you sort of got that process down pat. Let's switch the conversation a little bit and talk about sort of who inspired you to get involved in this, because it's not as if you woke up when you were like 10 years old and said, I want to be a children's book illustrator.
Right.
So who were sort of the mentors? Who were the people who sort of smoothed your path to get you to this point where you're at now?
That's a good question. It's funny because, like I said, getting into the arts late in my high school years, I was a comic book guy. I also did a lot of love comic books.
Who's your favorite comic book character?
Well, it's funny. I love Spider-Man and the X-Men, but what I loved about them, I mean, I love the stories because there was always a struggle. You have superpowers, but you have this struggle. But what I loved was, like, there would be certain artists from certain stories, and then it would be this perfect mix where you have this great writer with this really good artist, and then you have your character. So I can go back to the 70s and 80s Spider-Mans because I love that era. I love the
John Romita Jr., all those, or John Romita actually, all those guys.
John Romita, yes, and even Junior. I was a big fan of Junior.
Okay.
I love the X-Men with Chris Claremont's work.
Claremont.
Storytelling, John Byrne's art.
Oh my gosh, John Byrne was a double threat. That always amazed me how he could actually. And I'm a comic book guy too, so sort of how he would draw and write his own vision out there. But then you had a guy like Alan Moore that could do some amazing writing, but couldn't draw worth a lick.
Yeah.
He had on Dave Gibbons. Really helped.
Yes. And also, obviously Frank Miller. I love his work because he could write and draw. I loved his stuff with Daredevil and Batman, especially with Daredevil because during that time with Elektra and Bullseye and the Kingpin and this whole struggle, and there was always this one cover that really was powerful when you would see he was in the cemetery and he was hugging the headstone and.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, because the Elektra was killed by Bullseye. And he's just grieved, and I have that comic I still have some of my favorites. I got rid of a lot of them, but I kept my core favorites, which were the 70s and the 80s and some 90s with the McFarlane and Jim Lee.
Yes. Oh my gosh, I loved. Not to overrun you, but I loved Jim Lee. Jim Lee to me was sort of Jim Lee is the pinnacle sort of comic book illustrators. And the Image guys, and then breaking away from Marvel, and I will talk about the business of art in a minute, but that entire idea sort of gave me the impetus to sort of develop my own business and develop my own entrepreneurial practices, and now I'm out here doing this thing here. But I thought Jim Lee was probably the purest talent the comic books has produced probably since Steve Ditko.
Yeah, exactly. And to see, this great work, that helped, that just kind of influenced me. Probably a big influence was the Havoc Wolverine Meltdown miniseries because it had two different artists. It was funny because at the time, I was a big Ken Williams fan. I love Ken Williams. I love him to this day. I'm a friend on Facebook, so it's like, I'm actually friends, even though he doesn't know who the heck I am from like anybody other, from his other 5,000 Facebook friends. But still, to know that little messages, and I'm like, yay! But and John Muth, who's an award-winning children's book illustrator, he did these great books, but they teamed up and they did these books where they would illustrate, where Kent Williams did the Wolverine illustrations and John Muth did the Havoc ones. So you would have like these panels and there would be different art, and it was just like, wow. So then when I graduated high school, I was a computer science guy, and I went to OCC, which is a local community college, Onondaga Community College, and I started taking art classes, but then I realized, boy, I was a computer guy and an art guy second, but then I started to get more involved in art, and I had some great teachers there who, and it was funny because I ran into somebody who was around my era, and they were like, "Oh, you remember Mr. Rodrigo, and you remember Miss Griffin," and I'm like, "Oh my goodness, yes!" And we were sitting there having this like 20-minute conversation about these, teachers, and I think Mr. Rodrigo. What I loved about him is he was always bashing Disney because because it was like they would just take any story and they would just butcher it into Disney form. And
That's fabulous.
Yeah, and he was so honest, and he was brutal about it in a loving way. He would just he'd be like, don't worry, you guys, if you don't do your work, don't worry, you won't ever have a shot of being an artist. You could always tell when people were faking it.
You're right. When you need that crusty old guy, I had a version of that. I had a crusty old Russian that sort of drove me when I was in art school. But you need that. You need that sort of bitter, crusty, I'm anti-Disney, I hate the Mouse House kind of guy to sort of drive students to produce something better.
Right. He was brutal, but the thing is though, what I realize is if they comment on your work, that means if they nitpick it, that means it's good and they have to find your faults. Mm-hmm. And when I left OCC and I went to SU, probably one of my biggest influences was Bob Dacey, because Bob Dacey, when I came there in the mid-90s, he was professor up there. He was doing admissions. So I came up there with my portfolio, and he's like talking to me, and he's like, "You have no paintings, though. You only have drawings. I mean, they're good drawings and stuff, but you have no paintings. Do you have any painting experience?" And I'm like, no. But so then he just sat down and started to talk to me about illustration and what it was. And I never knew what illustration was. I knew about comic book art and some form, like fine arts, but he broke down what illustration was, and he took his time, and he was kind, and he sat and he would draw like the human figure, and he would just like, with no figure around, he's like sketching and giving me a de facto lesson. And he's like, "Yeah, we'll see if you can get in." And I had to wait, and then I got in, and then I'm like honored to call him a friend today. I could still email him or see him up at SU and talk to him. And he's like, he looks at I've showed him my books, showed him my art. He'll be honest, which is good. But then he'll also, he gives you compliments like, the things that feel like, okay, I've arrived to some degree, like, "Oh, you did a great job designing this page, and I like what you did with this," and, and it was like, and I'm telling him, I'm like, in my head, I'm like, "Well, I learned this from you because I soaked up, like, some of this stuff that you told me, and it just drums into my head,"
right?
Like his words about design, about, composition, setting up a page, sometimes challenging the viewer. Don't, if you see words on the page, sometimes illustrate what's not on the words, what the words don't show, and challenge the viewer. Don't want to be so literal with everything. And, those things really help. So and then James Ransom, he's an African-American illustrator. He's been in the business for about 30 years. He's been a great friend of mine and a great influence. So I think to name off just those people. So
excellent. Yeah. I mean, I think, everybody who's in a creative profession, and I think the creatives, as a whole, anybody who's in a creative profession, actually, I have a tiny blog experiment that I'm doing on Quora.com called the 150 Points of Light blog, because, we couldn't get 149 points. We had to get 150 in there. And so, one of the things that I blog about, it's very short little things, too long for a tweet, but not long enough for a blog post. And one of the things I said is, artists and designers and creatives, illustrators, anybody with visual knowledge and sort of that ability to sort of pick up visuals is going to do really, really well, I think, in the 21st century, as long as they learn coding. And it's interesting to me. You said you started out as a computer guy, and then you switched over to the art practice. and you do a lot of painting. Do you do anything with the computer end of it? Are you doing any of that sort of? Have you translated any of those painting skills into Photoshop or Lightroom or any of those kinds of platforms?
Yeah, especially with the sketch phase, what I'll do is I'll do some drawings and sketches, and I'll scan them in, and then I'll put them on Photoshop, and then I'll just kind of tweak them and work the values in black and white with Photoshop. And then what I love about Photoshop is that if I draw something up and it doesn't work, you could just simply grab the wand tool and move it and shrink it, enlarge it, and just kind of play with design. And I think it's actually made me a better designer. So I understand, okay, the text, the words on the page will go here in this corner, and then this big shape over here, I'm going to place this, and then maybe add a line. And it really does, like when I sit back and look at it, I'm like, okay, it's not working out as a design. It's not interesting. Where's my focal point? How am I going to, like, the other lines and angles or subjects where we want to draw away from them and pull them towards the main, where you want the eye to go. So that's what Photoshop allows. I haven't done painting per se with it. I love digital art. I have a lot of friends who do it, and they're just amazing. So it's a matter of picking their brains more and getting shortcuts and really diving in. My wife keeps telling me, you need to really try to do something, another book or something in the digital form. And I just want to kind of work at it a little bit more to tighten it up where I want it. As artists, we're never happy with our work anyway. So then I'll probably take forever.
Right. Yeah. Well, you. That's why Steve Jobs used to say, real artists launch. You gotta launch and then reiterate. You know what I mean? You have to release it out into the world. Well, you talked about your mentors, and you talked a little bit about sort of conflicts in the work, and with other folks who are also trying to sort of get the highest value out of the work. What is the entrepreneurial process like? Because one of the things that we know, there's art and then there's business, and traditionally, those two have not met. But now with digital tools, like you were just saying, digital illustrators, they have the opportunity to sort of manage their own careers, and really manage their own development, and really put money in their own pocket with, not just with social media, but with the rise of, digital art blogs, and digital art places on the internet, and location websites on the internet, as well as Tumblr and things like that, and so and platforms like that, not things like that, but platforms like that. So how have you have you built a platform online, or what's sort of that entrepreneurial journey been like for you, being a children's book illustrator?
It's another good question, because I think my agent was telling me, that Facebook alone isn't enough. You need to get on the Instagrams, you need to get on the Pinterest, you need to get on the Tumblrs. If you get on those and you kind of humanize who you are, it helps sell you. Right. Because word gets around. That's the great thing about the internet. It's the great equalizer where if you apply yourself, just like with your art, you would never know who's looking. I had a friend of mine who he just on his own he did an illustration from a book he loved, and he just shared us his process on Facebook, and lo and behold, the author loved it and wanted to include it in a compilation of illustrations in a book form. He got asked. They wanted to buy the rights to it. So, those opportunities. For me, I have to be more active. I get so locked into these four walls of this studio. I don't take advantage of what the internet, because I may be locked in, but I do have an access point both inward and outward with the computer. And, it's just, when I apply myself more to the Facebooks, especially like Instagram, because I think if you just set up a camera on a tripod and then just do a painting and just talk, just be real. I've seen friends do that, and they just launch it, and then people just love it, and then you get teachers will look at it because that's my lifeblood, teachers and librarians, the educational field, because children's books, that's what they share in class.
Right.
They could be your fans where they want your art, like prints of your art, not just your books. Or then they want you to come to their school. So if you invite them in with the social media, even talking about, oh man, I went to go pick apples today, or just like things like that, they feel a connection. Because without that connection, it's harder to get into where those people are with my audience. I can send out flyers and I can, email people, but if I don't have something more tangible like Instagrams, like, the Pinterest where you're just looking at work and I'm just talking, or a blog, then, I'm fighting this uphill battle, and I have to be more, but that's my problem because I don't do that more.
But let me encourage you sort of in our conversation here a little bit, because I don't want you to despair. I mean, you've got the content. This is the thing. You've got the work, right? I mean, you've been doing this. You say you're relatively young. You've been doing this 6-7 years, right? That's a 6-7 year. Think of it as if you've planted a tree, right? That's 6-7 years of growth.
Right.
And now the blogging and the Facebooking and all these other things. Now you can sort of figure out what are the other little tiny sprouts you want to plant around that tree to make it sort of look a little bit better. Right. But you've already got the tree. You've already got the books that are out there that have influenced people. You've already got sort of the speaking engagements that you do, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and the influence that you've had over the lives of young people. So you've got that tree growing. Mm-hmm. Social media is just sort of becomes the pretty flowers at that point, right?
Right. Yeah, it's the mulch and the flowers around it just dolls it up, and that's what that's my goal. That's as I go forth, especially late 2014 into 2015, just to go forth and share, because if you share more, people love that stuff, and that's what I have to do. You sit down and you just sketch something out. You share like a sketchbook. You like I have a sketchbook here, and you just scan images and you just put them up, and just like, man, it's just why I drew this today, because this is my mood and the colors and the actions and people love that stuff, and that's what I have to do more of. I never but that's the goal as I press forward, because I have to sell my brand.
Right.
London Lad
is
a brand, and there's a demand, and you've got to feed that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, and I think I've seen your work. I've seen the work that you put out there. I've heard you tell your story. You've built that brand and you've created that brand. And so now I think it's a matter of, at least, from where I'm sitting, as a fan and as a person who's sort of out here, in the audience, sort of saying, hey, you've got the brand. It's just a matter of curating that brand and really showing letting other folks into other aspects of that brand.
Right.
Which, speaking of which, you do a lot of speaking engagements, with young people. How has that helped you with your exposure, and what do you talk about when you go in front of young people and talk?
Well, what I do is when I go to a school, I usually it's elementary schools, but I've done high school and middle schools. What I try to do is I try to share. They think when they see me come in, they know, oh, he's the illustrator, he's the artist. Oh, I can't, But what I try to do is basically break down how I got here, to understand that it's a process, that life, it's not easy, it's a lot of hard work, and I try to basically open up me as a person, as a young person, growing up with my struggles, to growing up with my insecurities, things, single parent household, because I think when they understand that, oh, I may be standing up here and I do books, but you know what? I'm a human being. I've made my mistakes. I've had heartache. I've had triumph. I persevere, and the thing is, when I go to schools, I always try to finish off everything with 3 words, which is passion, patience, and perseverance. Those 3 P's, because I tell kids, I was like, that passion is that love of something. So if you love to be a judge, love to be a lawyer, if you love to be a cardiologist or something that you love, that love will get you going. But then there's going to be that perseverance that you're going to go through, and that perseverance is that trial, is that endurance that you fight through. But that love for it helps you with that perseverance. And then you have that patience, because if you love something and you persevere, you're going to have to be patient through it. And I always make sure to end, I give little hints throughout my presentation about that. I had to be patient. I failed out of school, so that means if I flunked out of Syracuse University, I had to reassess, take care of family, and then come back later. And there's that perseverance, and then having the patience to know that, that it's going to come. So, because I think kids in this day of the internet, they think everything is so quick and so easy, and it's not. You gotta be, without those, I would not be here today. And for children, when they get that, and young people, that's the one thing that they don't have, is sometimes they don't have the passion for it, because passion comes and it goes as quick as a click of a mouse, as quick as a Vine video, 6 seconds long. And the perseverance to know that, boy, this is going to be difficult. There's going to be resistance. And you got to know with that resistance that it's only going to make you stronger, like iron. Heat makes iron stronger.
Well, iron sharpens. Well, from the Bible, iron sharpens iron.
Right.
That kind of concept. Have you ever read anything by Stephen Pressfield? His famous book called The War on Art.
No, I have to look that up.
Yeah, it's an amazing book. He talks, and marketers like Mitch Joel and Seth Godin recommended this book and have read it. And for people who are in, sort of marketing, which isn't really thought of as being creative, but it has a lot of the creative elements that you've been talking about for the last 40 minutes, really focuses on really getting through and fighting through that resistance.
Right.
And really fighting through that time when, as Seth Godin would call it, the dip. When, like you said, passion fades and perseverance is the only thing that's going to get you through that. And the dip will happen.
It does. It does. It's the nature of anything in life. You always go through, it's like a writer's block. It's a creative. I've had creative blocks where it's just, I can't draw anything. I can't paint anything. And sometimes it's external with life. Sometimes it's internal with struggles that you deal with, whether it's self-induced struggle, whether it's maybe family struggle, maybe whatever struggle. And like I said, that's what I always try to tell kids, and then I share, the big thing I like to share about is the fact of how not having a father figure in my life, not having a father, a dad, really affected me in a negative way, whether it was anger, lashing out, sadness and depression, to insecurities, but then knowing that as I got older into my teens, and you get those rebellious, angry teenage years, and they carry into your young 20s, and then when you realize, I can't be mad. I can't be mad at this person because it's not going to help me in my life.
Right, yeah.
And I tell that to kids, and when I went to a school in Baltimore, I was talking to this, and I was speaking on, I don't know if I could, I don't have any anger, but I don't know if I could ever talk to the guy, because in a way, in reality, if I can be real with you young people, there's a sense of fear. I may stand up here and I talk, but it doesn't mean that I'm not scared. Even as a 40-plus-year-old man, I'm still would be afraid to talk to this person, even though I harbor no ill will.
Right.
And then there was a boy who got all these questions, and there's this boy in the back who was just like, do you think, he raises his hand, and he's like, do you think you'll ever not be afraid? You ever think you'll be brave enough, you know? And it just hit me, and he just looked at me with these eyes, and just unwavering eyes just stared at me, just peered into me, and there was this connection, and I just looked at him, and I just took a few steps closer, and I was like, you know what? And I had to pause, and I was like, I don't know. That's a really good question. I said, I don't know if I could lift that fear. Mm-hmm. And I have to be honest. I can't sit there and say, no, I will overcome it. No, you know, because who knows what, maybe he's dealing with that fear, right, you know, of something. And you got to understand that fear, and that's like with art. There's like this big fear, you know, art is always about fear. Because right, there's always this insecurity and this fear, like, is my work good enough? I can look at a book that I just illustrated, and I'll look at it, and like this book right here, Lend a Hand, and I'll look at it, and I'll look at the cover, and I'm like, oh my goodness, it's the worst thing ever. Like, why did I send this artwork off? Look at this, it's just bothering me, and I have to close it up because it drives me mad. Because then I feel like I regress. But I'm digressing here. I'm sorry.
Well, no, I mean, it's really good. I mean, I think that part of the creative process is fighting through the fear and really navigating that fear. And I think that we're at a unique time in human history, at least in the Western world. And by the Western world, I mean, you know, the postmodern Western world. So, you know, the United States, Canada, you know, Japan, Western Europe, those kinds of areas where we've reached this point where we're not out digging ditches anymore, mm-hmm, and we're not really working for our food day in and day out. So now we have time to really have these other kinds of struggles, mm-hmm, and our brains, our amygdalas, you know, our cerebellums don't know the difference between, you know, not having a food come in on a planting and not having food that we gather on the Serengeti, and not having the bill get paid so food doesn't get delivered to our house. Our brains don't know that. Right. Our amygdala and our cerebellum and our fear construct only knows this is an external stimulus that's coming in and I'm scared, you know, and I'm going to have this response here. Or I'm disgusted or whatever. Right. And the other piece is, you know, with you talked about that sort of that maturation process that you hit in your 20s. You say in your late 20s, right?
We'll say mid.
Early.
My whole 20s was a maturation process.
Okay, the whole 20s, yeah, well, that's for most people. So I look at that as sort of the arc where, you know, you have that moment where you sort of see your parents, whether they were absent or not, as human beings. You start to see them as people versus this sort of image you have in your brain of my parent is over here on this mountain and I'm this little kid. Right. And you know, and that's a huge conflict that I sort of deal with some of my clients, because they still haven't made that switch over, mm-hmm, you know, and they're still carrying around sort of all of the anger and the junk from their childhood, right, you know, and they can't let go of those things in order to move on and accept more adult things. Right. So, but it sounds as though, I mean, you've done that, and it sounds as though you're working through even more of a cathartic process when you speak in front of groups of young people.
Yeah, that's what I just try to just connect to them, because if you can't be real, and that's the nature of kids today. Mm-hmm. You have to be real. So if you're not real, they're going to read right through it, and they're just going to tune you right out. Right. You'll get that glassy-eyed look, and they'll just yawn and, you know, not pay attention. You know, not every kid you reach, but, you know, you reach some kids, whether it's just through that, maybe through your art, you know, because you're there for your art, so they really connect. You know, you have a lot of kids connecting with the art, but then, you know, you connect to kids like on an emotional level, like as a human being, more than just the art, you know. But it doesn't matter, as long as, you know, if you get something out of this, great, you know. If not, that's okay, you know. I'm glad you came. I'm glad, you know, you were nice and you sat and you were quiet and
yep,
you left, you know.
You left, yeah, exactly. All right, well, you know, we've talked a lot about a lot of heavy stuff, you know. We've talked about sort of your art process and sort of the entrepreneurial process a little bit, for being an illustrator. But I mean, have you ever had a moment, and everybody sort of has this moment of frustration where you're sort of like, you know what, I'm just done. Like I want to go mow the lawn, or I just, you know what, I'd like to go, I'd like to go, sell records at like a Coconuts somewhere and get like a steady paycheck and just be done with all this nonsense. Have you ever had that? Have you ever had that sort of John Cusack high fidelity moment?
Yeah, just last week. Just
That's
last
fabulous.
week I had it where I was like, I am done. I can't take this anymore. Because it's just everything that comes. Like the art isn't, here's the twofold. I love social media, like Facebook, but then when you look on Facebook and you look at it, seems like everybody does a painting every 2 minutes or something, and look at me, I just signed a new deal, and I won this award, and I have to literally click out of Facebook because then I start to get really upset. I get envious, or I'll just get negative, so I have to like click and get away from Facebook for a few days and just focus on me. Or then, or it'll come in like family, like my wife wants this, or we're fighting about this, or family this, or money's tight here, and then you get that perfect storm when all of them just hit at the same time. Like I can usually endure. And like, okay, it's kind of messing me up artistically, but I'll push through. But then when they just all come together like a perfect storm in this vortex, and all of a sudden it's spinning and the winds are getting higher and heavier and stronger, all of a sudden it's like, oh my goodness. And then it's like, I can't do this. And then, I literally make myself go to bed early. Go to bed around 10:30, wake up, and, it's a new day. And start fresh, and okay, I don't want to quit. Do I really? What scene always comes into my head whenever I have that moment, and it's at its worst moment, and then I make myself go to bed and just. You remember this scene in Officer and a Gentleman? Remember the scene where Lou Gossett Jr. is trying to break him out in the rain?
Oh yeah, yeah.
He's like, quit, mayonnaise, quit. And he's just like, I can't. I got nothing else.
Right.
You know what I mean? And that scene always comes into my head where he's just like, I can't quit. There's no going back. I can't do anything. There's nothing else I can do. And that's the way I am, because I'm like, I have an art degree. You know what I mean? It's not like I can go out and, be a radiologist. Do I want to go back to school? I don't mind. I could go back, but it's like, no, I'm in this. I'm going, and I'm committed to this. So I can't. There's nothing else. I'm in it now.
Right. So, yeah. Well, and it's like you've cordoned off all of your other things.
Right.
You said, you know what? No, this is the hill I'm dying on, and that's it. I mean,
it's like Hamburger Hill here. I'm going up.
It's like exactly
I'm going up.
like Hamburger Hill. There's no. I'm not doing anything else. Like I don't know how to do anything else. So that's definitely something where I understand that, and I pick up on that. But yeah, I mean, I always ask my guests sort of what is that moment, because everybody has that moment of frustration. I don't care if you're selling stocks and you're in high finance. Maybe folks there have it less often, or you're making art. I mean, but everybody has that moment where they sort of look around at their environment and they say, you know what? This isn't working. I could go sell Slurpees at 7-Eleven or something.
Because I was a parking attendant at Syracuse University. I was like, I can go back to there and just sit around in a parking booth and just waste away. Not to say it wasn't bad, because it got me my college education for free, my wife's master's degree. It was a great job in that season. But then, I go back every once in a while and I'm like, boy, I could just sit in this booth and get paid like good money just to sit in the booth and tell people if you can come on campus or not, and eventually get a free meal here or there, and work at a few SU football games or basketball games, and just kind of coast along. But I think when I look at some of those people, and they're good people, and I consider them friends still, they're just mundane going along. I have a good friend of mine, he's like 46 years old, and he's just coasting along. And it's like, and I always ask him, like, what, do you have any more ambition? You're still young enough where you could do something else. You got a wife and you got kids. do you ever just get the motivation? And he's just like, no. And I'm like, well, then I guess I don't want to go back to that, because I just
Right.
I don't want to, because then I'll regret it.
Yep.
As much as art illustration can be a struggle, and I'm the starving artist, thank God my wife is a teacher. She makes good money, and she loves me to death and puts up with me. But then I think, like, what else can I do where I'm getting paid to learn? I'm getting paid to create. It's like when you look at, like, somebody who's like a pro athlete. Those pro athletes are getting paid to play a game. I'm getting paid, making a living doing art. I'm doing something that kids in school that's considered, like with gym and music and art. They're like, it's fun because they're not doing the core curriculum of math, science, and even though it's as important because it helps relieve the stress of a day of doing schoolwork, those extras that you have. But I'm getting paid to do something to create. And and the other thing that gets me going, that brings me back to loving art, is the fact is, there's a children that read your books. So when they read those books, you never know how it touches them. It could help them through their difficult times. Because I know for me, when I was a kid, what got me through my depression, what got me through a lot of the angst of being an only child, was I would open up the Peanuts Gang comic books, like strips. I used to get the big thick books where you'd have like hundreds of them. And I would read, and they would just carry me through during a rough time. So for a book, you would hope that at that time that book can reach, even in this media where everything is tablet, we're fighting the tablet and the computer and the smartphone, but there's still tangible things to a book that a kid can just look and carry and hold on to, go to the library. I work in an after school, and I've seen at an elementary school, I've seen kids in the library and how excited they are to get a book.
No, I'll do it, yeah.
I know. Children that bring around that innocence, that purity of the kids, and they're honest,
Right. Oh yeah. Kids aren't going to lie because there's no money in it.
Yeah.
Like they don't gain anything from it. And they don't know how. They don't know what that gain would be. Well, I would love to continue talking to you. We've had a great conversation.
Yeah.
I think that you've really got a lot more to say, and I would love to have you back on the show at a certain point in the future.
Definitely.
What would you like to promote today, if anything, to the listeners of Earbud U?
If you want, you can go to my website, londonlad.com. It's just like my name is spelled with 2 D's for lad. You can check out my website. If you're looking for somebody to come to present at your school, my rates are pretty fair. To come and talk to your kids, to do workshops. So if you're interested, you can go to my website and reach me there. You can email me through there. I got books. So far,
you're on all the major bookstores.
Yeah, you can go on Amazon. Even though publishers are fighting Amazon because I'm cutting, but. You can go to Amazon, Barnes and Nobles. You got my books. You'll see them there. Like Lend a Hand. This is probably one of my most recent books here. And it's a great book because what I loved about this book is it's about different kids of different races and backgrounds, and what they do is they do things to help other people, whether it's giving up your seat on a bus to an old man, giving up half your lunch to a new kid in school, cleaning up a park, writing a letter to a soldier overseas, a choir singing to senior citizen homes. It's a book that that I love because it was near and dear to my heart because I love to help people. I'm a very giving and helpful person. So this one I touched my heart on many levels as a human. But yeah,
awesome.
Just visit my website. You can email me if you have any questions. If you want to buy any prints or artwork.
Yep. Email you at London Lad Studios. Londonlad at.
London@londonlad.com.
There we go. That's it. Yeah, there it is. Yeah. So the email address, the website, the book. We want to thank London Lad for coming on to Earbud U. And if you'd like to follow us, please check out our Twitter feed at earbud_U on Twitter. We're also on Instagram. You can check us out, earbud_U on Instagram. And please take the time to check out the Human Services Consulting and Training page on Facebook, Human Services Consulting and Training. You can also check out our website, www.hsconsultingandtraining.com. Once again, we'd like to thank the London Lad for coming on the Earbud U podcast. London, you have a great rest of your day.
You too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And we're out.